I'm Allison Bell. I'm the executive director here. I actually have a board member with us tonight, Steve Lucchese. He's an amazing architect with Ziegler Cooper. He's responsible for that. We just renovated our museum, and he and his firm did a great job. And he's got another co-worker with him who actually worked on this design, which I just learned about tonight. So welcome. Thank you all for being here. We have a good crowd. Apparently there's an Astros game. Who knew? Everybody's, it's hard to get here because it's popular right now, but we are so excited so far to be celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We have not done this since I've been here, and I've been here almost 5 years, so I'm really excited that we're reaching out to the community, and we need to learn more about it as well. We have two wonderful speakers tonight, Dr. Son Mai, and he is with Midland Midland College, and he came all the way from there to speak with us today, so we're really excited to have him. He teaches organizational management. And then of course we have Chau Nguyen, who most of you all know, Chief Public Strategies Officer at Houston Area Women's Center, and she brought some co-workers with her as well. We're very excited to have her. She spent 15 years as a TV journalist, and last served as an anchor with KHOU-TV. You probably get sick of hearing your own bio. Yeah. She's the first, my husband hates it too. She's the first Vietnamese American journalist to receive an Emmy Award, this is what I think, is for her documentary series covering a medical mission in Vietnam. I hope you'll talk to us about that too. And she has a fascinating story about escaping, so I want to hear about that. So I think Dr. Mai is going to go first, and then Chau will come right up. I wanted to mention we have Vietnamese spring rolls that were from Jenny's Noodle House, because Chau is good friends with Jenny. I'm sorry she wasn't able to be here tonight, but they were very nice. Those are in the back. We have wine and cheese, Cokes, water, so don't run off after or run go get something before. And yes,
we have a special guest.
Oh, we do have special guests. We have our special guest is Quoc-Anh Tran. Did I say that right?
Yes.
And he is the president of the Vietnamese Community Center in Houston. So we're very honored to have him with us. And we have a couple of members here tonight, and then our little tiny team of staff. So we're excited to be here, and take it away.
All right, thank you, Allison.
Yeah.
And today I'm going to give a brief overview of the Vietnamese community in Texas, how the Vietnamese community came here, how the community settled, some of the challenges that they face, and where to go in the future. So I've timed this to about 15 to 20 minutes, so that will be our expected period. And if you would go to the first slide. And the Vietnamese community was literally non-existent in Texas until about the 1960s. And of course, we know during the 1960s, there's conflict in Vietnam, and the United States is involved in the conflict. And through various programs, the United States would bring Vietnamese nationals or South Vietnamese nationals to Texas for various training programs. And which this is a little clearer, but this is an identification card for a South Vietnamese airman stationed at Fort Bliss in the 1960s. This is signed by Governor John Connally of Texas at the time, and pretty much says that this individual is an honorary citizen of Texas and a guest of Texas, and to really treat the person as a guest. Now, there are various other groups okay, thank you so much. There are various other groups that also came to Texas as various programs such as USAID, and also as international students. So I looked at some of the international student records during my research at various universities, including the University of Houston, and quite a lot of international students before 1975. So about 40 international students from South Vietnam, and the total number of Vietnamese in Texas altogether was 607 in 1973. So fast forward to the next slide. In 1973, as you may recall, the United States engaged in withdrawal from South Vietnam, and by 1975, and this is the bottom picture that you're probably most familiar with here. In 1975, the North Vietnamese, which is the communist side, overran the South Vietnamese government. It was a relatively quick collapsed. The South Vietnamese government collapsed by April 30th of 1975. And in the leading months before the collapse, initially there was a belief that South Vietnam was still going to be viable. So you had a lot of movement coming in from the central highlands or the central part of Vietnam into Saigon. And it turned out that the South Vietnamese military wasn't going to hold out on its own. There were attempts to bring in more funding, attempts to try to at least rescue the South, but in the end, there was this withdrawal, which is really what led to this picture down here. This is a picture of pretty much US personnel, and this is an apartment complex. This is a chute for ventilation, and there's a helicopter that went to the top. Now, in addition to the withdrawal of US personnel, US businessmen, those that had interest in South Vietnam, 133,000 South Vietnamese nationals also left around that time period. That includes my parents. My father was in the South Vietnamese Navy. He was stationed on a ship known as the LST, or the landing ship tank. And before the collapse, there was a hidden agreement with US military leaders to withdraw the South Vietnamese Navy and move it to safety along with the personnel inside. So that allowed my parents and some close relatives to leave. I'm second generation, so I'm born in the United States. I'm born in Grand Prairie, Texas in 1978. So 133,000 Vietnamese nationals, where are they going? And many would be processed in the Philippines, Guam, and given humanitarian parole. And you may have heard the term humanitarian parole in the news recently, especially with refugees from Afghanistan and the Ukraine. And what humanitarian parole is it's a temporary condition of safety. There is no guarantee that an individual will be given citizenship. So they're waiting to see what the situation is like in South Vietnam. And of course, things didn't get any better. Nearby Cambodia, there was the Maiguez incident where the US had to rescue a ship from the communist Khmer Rouge. So what the United States ended up doing after granting humanitarian parole is to try to assimilate. And this is a term I generally don't like to use in my history classes. I like to use the term acculturation better, but the term that they wanted at the time was assimilation, make the refugees as American as possible, and call it a day. And so what the US did was they brought the refugees from the initial processing centers, again, Guam, the Philippines, to a series of 4 campsites across the United States. The one closest to Texas is Fort Chaffee in Arkansas. There's also a facility in Florida, Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. I think Florida's Elgin Air Force Base, Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, and Camp Pendleton in California. Now, my parents were sent to Fort Chaffee in Arkansas. And this is the picture of what the camp looked like in 1975. You can see there are several South Vietnamese children running around. Me and my family went to this camp during my spring break about a month ago, and I tried to find the same exact spot to take the picture. So this is what it looks like a month ago. So they've paved the road, but what's interesting now is that the campsite is a economic development base. So this is where the business side of me comes out, but there are tax advantages to taking a barrack and converting it into a small business. So there's a lot of coffee shops and a lot of art galleries that's there today. Now, after the 4 camps, the idea of the US government, and this was by policy, was to disperse the Vietnamese immigrants and send Vietnamese immigrants to sponsors all across the country, regardless of conditions. So we would see Vietnamese refugees had just left tropical South Vietnam, and they're now in cold northern Idaho, for instance. Or they're in various areas that wasn't a fit. So what eventually happened to what they call the dispersion policy was that it failed. There was an internal migration that took place, and during this internal migration, many people would keep in contact with one another. They would communicate with each other by letters, and they would write, and people would begin to talk about places with good conditions. And Houston is one area with a subtropical climate and favorable conditions. The Gulf Coast area of Texas, New Orleans, and Louisiana, California. So we would see many people leave the areas that they were initially settled, and these became some of the first Vietnamese American communities across the country. In fact, when I did my research, I remember there was a story about how some of the first Vietnamese businesses appeared in the downtown area, and they were selling various, quote, exotic delicacies at the time. Now, the US actually thought that after they basically cut their losses from Vietnam, we settled, those that left with the Americans, they'd call it a day. The last camp closed around Christmas time in 1975, but something else was looming, and we can go into the next slide here. And from 1975 to about 1989, the high point, the zenith, took place around 1979 to about 1982. But things did not improve in Vietnam. The new government, the new regime, tried to install a Marxist ideal into an area where the people are used to capitalist ideas. So it didn't work out. This led to famine. This also led to a lot of repression, as those who try to speak up about it were mysteriously sent away. Many people who were affiliated with the old government would be sent to what they euphemistically called a re-education camp, which was more of a prison camp than anything else. And the economy actually just started going downhill until finally the Vietnamese realized maybe communism isn't working here. We should come out with some other system, which is really what's led to the type of economic and political system that Vietnam has today, which they call the markets or the socialist market economy. But in the meantime, from 1975 to about 1989, many people found it difficult to stay in Vietnam, and many took the risk to escape. And as you can see in this type of craft, if you're familiar with craft, it doesn't look very seaworthy. And these are barely seaworthy boats, and the people involved in emigrating from Vietnam are known as the boat people. And the high point took place around 1979. And just looking at world history, what happened in that area in 1979 was that the Khmer Rouge, the communist government in Cambodia, was becoming extremely radical. They began to terrorize the Vietnamese minority in Cambodia. The Vietnamese communists decided to overthrow that communist government and install their own version of a communist government. And this involved more people drafted, called up for military service. They've just gotten out of a war. There's another one. Now, Cambodia had a very big friend, which was the PRC, or China. And China invaded shortly after the Vietnamese government overthrew the Khmer Rouge. So it's a mess in that area. And so that's led to more push or more reason to leave Vietnam. And overall, there's an estimated, and we can't get the exact numbers because many people just perished at sea and they're gone. But we estimate about 800,000 people leaving Vietnam during this time period. Now, where are they going? This is seriously a risk right here. Many of the boat people are looking at kind of two areas. The first area, hopefully they could reach land. It could be in Malaysia, in an area known as Pulau Bidong. They could reach Hong Kong, or they could reach the Philippine Islands. So very difficult, but what they're also hoping for is to be intercepted by a larger, perhaps a trade ship or cargo ship that's in that area, since the region that's known as the South China Sea is an area of a lot of trading that's taking place. So what we eventually see is a refugee crisis, and this refugee crisis is pretty much becoming a worldwide issue right here. So various other countries in Southeast Asia are now involved in the situation. Their economies, their regions just cannot handle an influx of people. So what's this led us to is an attempt to try to provide a safer and more controlled means of immigration to the United States, which we can go to the next slide. And what happened beginning about I know this is a little cut off here, 1988 and 1989, is that Vietnam is starting to change. They no longer embrace that idea that they're going to reach a pure communist society. In fact, this is very similar with virtually every communist government. They realize maybe communism isn't working. And so they begin to introduce capitalist reforms, and also at the same time, they're trying to reach out to other countries, particularly in the West. So obviously, an exodus of people leaving is probably bad PR for Vietnam, but also at the same time, the United States, third countries, also are seeking more humanitarian ways to allow for immigration to their respective countries. So we see a movement away from escaping by boat and more towards more routine patterns of immigration. Now, it's not routine in that we see in a modern sense today, which I'll discuss in a moment, but the US and Vietnam will, as one of the conditions to have normalized relations, first off, to locate the remains of POWs, locate the remains of those MIA killed in action from the Vietnam conflict, but also to really address the desire for former American allies in Vietnam to have the chance to immigrate to the United States. So the Orderly Departure Program, otherwise known as ODP, was one of the first programs that was negotiated, and what it involved was that it involved those that had connections that may have come to the United States at an earlier period. They can sponsor a person coming to the United States. There's also other categories that would allow for immigration to take place. But the two other forms that were pretty much unique to the Vietnamese immigration experience is the Humanitarian Operations Program, otherwise in Vietnamese known as the HAC O program, which stands for just HO, 2 letters. And what the Humanitarian Operations Program involved was that those that have proof that they were persecuted by the communist governments, if they have paperwork, for instance, that indicated that they were sent to re-education, or there was some sort of proof that they were persecuted for their involvement and their connections with the United States, they were allowed to immigrate to the United States. Now, the second group that was also unique is the Amerasian Homecoming Act. During the war itself, we have a lot of children that were born out of liaisons between Americans and Vietnamese, and these children were seen as children of the enemy in Vietnam. Heavily persecuted, denied opportunities, denied education, and the United States will eventually negotiate to allow for the Con Lai, which pretty much means mixed children, to come to the United States, as well as their families. Now, this is part of a process that would lead to normalization. In the late 1980s, during the first Bush administration, or George H.W. Bush administration, there was a desire to rebuild diplomatic relations, trade relations with Vietnam. This again involved trying to resolve the MIA, KIA issue, and also those that are allied with the United States. And it's not until about 1994, 1995 that we have normalized relations with Vietnam and the United States. And with that, we start to see normal immigration patterns as well. But there's also a couple of unique cases. First off, we see the normal green card immigration channel, but we also see a lot of students with F1 visas, and these are international students. And what makes this interesting is that when it comes to the international students from Vietnam, many were a part of a program that was known as the VEF, or the Vietnam Education Foundation. And how it worked was that South Vietnam, during the war years, had foreign debt. They borrowed money from the United States, they borrowed money from other countries that's kind of how finance works. So what happened to that debt after North Vietnam took over South Vietnam in 1975? The debt was negotiated in about 1997, 1998 under the Clinton administration. And what it involved was that Vietnam will pay off South Vietnam's debt, but that money would be used to fund a scholarship fund. So this becomes the basis of the VEF. And so we have a lot of international students from Vietnam to the United States, and many are coming through that funder. Now, I mentioned, so far I've talked about Vietnamese immigrating to the United States, and I've also gave some context of how several Vietnamese groups ended up in Texas. So if we go to the next slide, I want to focus a little more on the Vietnamese in Texas. The Vietnamese in Texas, the experience varied. It could be rough at times. There were times also wonderful experiences. In the end, I would say the Vietnamese contributed greatly to the culture of Texas. But after the resettlement process, there was an area that became very attractive to Vietnamese refugees. And this was the Gulf Coast area. And this Gulf Coast area actually went from Corpus Christi to about Mobile, Alabama, in a community known as Bayou La Batre. And there's a reason why Vietnamese were attracted to that area. The first reason was that the climate is very similar to Vietnam. The second reason was that there were several very charismatic leaders, religious leaders, mainly Catholic priests, who were able to convince their flock to settle in the areas in the Gulf Coast region. And the third reason was that area allowed for one of the few professions that could be transferred from Vietnam to the United States, and this is commercial fishing. Most professions, for instance, many people who are lawyers in Vietnam, I know many people with law degrees from Vietnam, they couldn't practice in the United States. And the running joke in my family was they might practice in Louisiana, but in reality that wasn't the case. But commercial fishing was one of the few that was transferable, and a lot of refugees are coming into an area where the economy, the seafood industry that year, and this is the late 1970s here, just wasn't very good. So you had inflation, you had a lot of the problems that we see today where people are starting to forego a lot of luxury goods because of the cost, and that includes seafood. So what happened is that we have a group of Vietnamese fishermen, and suddenly they're seen as adverse competition. This led to accusations that the government had placed that group there to undermine the local fishermen that were already there. There was also various other conspiracy theories, but what really came out would be tension in a town called Siege of Texas. This is where my uncle is a commercial fisherman even today. But in 1979, what happened was that there was a brawl that started off between local fishermen and the Vietnamese immigrants. 2 people got shot, killed, eventually this became it took a racially motivated bent here. We have this gentleman, I don't know why I should call him gentleman, but this is Louis Beam. He's the Grand Dragon of the Chameleon Knights of the KKK. I think he was based in Vider at the time. He started to recruit the Klan to try to chase out the Vietnamese fishermen. Of course, fortunately, he failed. There would be attempts to try to find middle ground, and that really turned out to be the case. It turned out to be a lot of cultural differences between the Vietnamese and Texas commercial fishermen. And some of the differences could include licensing. You need a fishing license in the United States to fish. Even the direction of where to pull the nets. In Vietnam, the nets are pulled north to south. So they follow the stars and they pull the nets north to south. Around the Gulf Coast area, not so much, more of the east to west area. So we had some tension in place. There was also some political tension within the Vietnamese community as well. After the war, there was still some animosity, and some animosity that can include accusations that somebody may have supported the communists during the war. And this led to several journalists who have published newspaper articles in the fledgling Vietnamese American media. And they were accused of having a communist slant to it, and eventually they were assassinated. So that still became still an unsolved mystery that I believe the FBI is still investigating today. But over time, what we eventually did see is the establishment of a community that is here to stay. You can see here's a apartment complex. It's called Tai Xuân Village. I've driven by it a couple times. I was told to go inside it sometime. It's supposed to be a neat community with communal gardens inside. Now in Beaumont, this is the Buddhist temple. This is Chùa Bu Mong, which is a play on words. Bu Mong can also mean Beaumont. And this is a former Baptist church. You can see the elements of the Baptist church. The steeple has been replaced by a stupa, but it is a symbol of a very, very strong community to this day. And more recently, this is a picture of one of the Buddhist temples in Houston. I believe it's in the southwestern part of town. And so the community is growing. It's fledgling. It's no longer fledgling. It's now becoming an integral part of the Texas heritage and Texas community. Now, where do we go from here is the big question that remains. And so right now, sociologists, historians are still trying to make sense of the second generation, like myself, and even the third generation, the children of the second generation. For instance, I have several cousins, third generation. I tell them Kiao Gong, and it's like, what are you saying to me, uncle? And so there's a lot that we will definitely learn over time. Now you're probably left to wonder about myself, what am I doing next? And we can go to the next slide. I'm actually trying to do research to find the first Vietnamese restaurant in Texas. And I think I found it, and it's not 1975, it's 1962. I think the first Vietnamese restaurant is 1962, and I was given a postcard by Professor Preuss, and he says this is a Vietnamese restaurant, and this is 1962. It's like, how can this be? And so I'm looking more into it. There is a restaurant in the Sheraton Hotel in Dallas. It's still the Sheraton Hotel in downtown Dallas. It's called the Saigon Port of Call Restaurant. And the Saigon Port of Call Restaurant, here's the postcard inside. I'm trying to find business records, to find the establishment. I'm also trying to find a menu. If this is not a Vietnamese restaurant, I'd like to see what passes as Vietnamese food in Dallas in 1962. And from there, I'd like to kind of build a narrative on what happened to the restaurant. I'm sure by 1967, 68, when the Vietnam conflict became unpopular, this restaurant either had to change its name or it went out of business. So we can go to the next slide. I hope you were able to get a lot out of my presentation today, and here's my contact information. Feel free to contact me. If not, I think we may have a Q&A session,
Yes.
or we'll also meet and chat up afterwards.
Questions for Dr. Mai?
Dr. Mai, your upbringing itself did that shape who you became and your interest in Vietnamese studies and history?
It really did. My upbringing was Arlington, Texas, which had a Vietnamese community, but I went to school in a very diverse junior high and high school. And I was always curious about the Vietnamese community, the Vietnamese church. I also have a uncle that was a fisherman in Seadrift. And so I'm curious on why my uncle remained as a fisherman and my father became an engineer. And so I was able to become a lot more inquisitive. I built a narrative, a dissertation that was based a lot on oral interviews, on discussions, on talks, and I was able to really get a lot more on my begins or how I came to be by just looking at the context of my family. Yes.
Well, I just want to thank you because this has always been a big question of mine is why Houston has such a large Vietnamese population. And this presentation has went a long ways to tell me that story. So
Thank you.
I've always really wanted to hear everything that I just heard. So thank you.
Very interesting.
So, Dr. Mai, do you have children?
I am single.
Single, okay.
I have a cat.
One of the
A Russian blue.
So yes, you have children.
one of the things we talk, Chau and I talk a lot about is carrying on the Vietnamese language with the next generation. If you had to guess, kind of percentage-wise of your peer group and so forth, I mean, what are you seeing? How many are carrying it on to that third generation?
Let's see, in my family, I count on my cousins, and I tried to talk to my second cousins who are the children, and I only two of my, because I nicknamed my nephews and nieces, I call them here and that, and they're the only ones that can communicate to me in Vietnamese. I feel that there's a disconnect. I am brainstorming about a way to preserve Vietnamese language, much like how Cajun French or the Pennsylvania Dutch did it.
I believe there's a question in the back.
I have a place in Corpus and was living through when the fishermen, the shrimpers in Corpus were fighting the Vietnamese shrimpers in Fulton. Just up the coast.
Oh, and Rockport Fulton. That is,
And it was really bad blood at that time. Now,
now it's east, and I think Rockport Fulton now considers the Vietnamese text and Dat Nguyen as one of their.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's a documentary.
Is there?
Yeah.
That one, and they have a restaurant there.
That's a
Parents.
sister.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Well, thank you. That was
All right, if you
wonderful.
have any further questions, we'll meet up.
Okay. Oh, take it away.
So I like to marry my pictures with words. One thing I'm going to talk about. First of all, I want to thank the Heritage Society, Allison and Anna. They've been so lovely and wonderful to work with. When they asked me, I was so heartened because I have two daughters. I'm a refugee immigrant. I want to thank my mother, who, because of her and my father's courage, I'm here. My aunt, Thuy, lived in Vietnam up until about 6 years ago, so her lived experience is very much what Dr. Mai was talking about. Those really hard decades before we reunited. My good friend David, my partner Jay, my colleague and friend Michelle, and her daughter Libby. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all the guests. I hope I can make this somewhat interesting and entertaining. It is my humbled life. It's been really fun to put together this PowerPoint pictorial because it really kind of pieces all the things that have happened over the years. This is just me and my family. Back in 1975, Dr. Mai talked about the first wave of Vietnamese immigrants and refugees. That was my family. We were the first wave. I love this photo. I did hijack some photos off the internet. Don't tell anybody. We won't publish this publicly. This will just be here. I love this because it's actually a billboard. You know, there was a time when Vietnam Town, as they would call it, would move from places in the city. This was in Midtown, which is now Midtown. And most of Chinatown and Vietnam Town is now in sort of the Southwest Bel Air area. But I just love the juxtaposition because it's like holding on to your heritage and, you know, making way for Westernization. Next. So my story starts with a love story. Because of them, I'm here. That is my father. He was a captain in the Army, and in the 60s, he met this hot smoking woman at a bus stop, and she was 16 years old. Don't tell anybody. And he followed her, and he wanted to be with her. And he met her, and he said, wow, she's beautiful. I really want to be with her. Back then, you can get married that young. So next slide. A year later, they were married. They had a wonderful wedding. My father has an interesting story because he's a musician. He's a composer. He started from the age of 12. He's a real gritty guy from a town just outside of Saigon, and he wrote music for a living. So from the 50s on, his stage name is Chau Nguyen. And he married my mother. And so from there, you know, they had their living. They lived in Saigon. He was still making music, writing songs, doing the whole music business, and thriving, essentially, in Saigon. Next slide. So this is in the 60s. That's actually my mother. They, you know, in Saigon, it's kind of like New York City. I've been a few times, and it's like you have your storefront, and then your second, third, fourth floor, you live there. So that's my mother tending to the music shop, my father posing in his musical way. That's circa late 1960s. Next slide. And so in the 1960s through the 70s, my parents had 4 kids. I am the youngest of 4. My sister, my brother, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. My brother, and that's my mother. These are kind of the final months, just taking pictures. My mom told me they kind of knew it was coming, so they documented some things. We don't have a lot of photos. I have no baby photos. That's about as young as I've seen. So the final months before we left. So we left on April 24th, and it took a while to get here, about I think 58 days or something we counted. This is on the U.S. aircraft carrier. What aircraft carrier? I'm not really sure. My father passed away a few years ago. I asked my mother. She said, I'm not really sure. But a big aircraft carrier. They brought 600 Vietnamese nationals on the boat. We left 6 days before the fall of Saigon. And my mother said, you know, it was through some military connections that we were able to get on the aircraft carrier and go with other Vietnamese families. That is me. That is my cousin. Those are cousins. That's my grandmother. Another cousin. Just to give you a little side of what they do, I have a cousin who's an attorney, a cousin who is a patent attorney. She's a very successful patent attorney. So education, obviously, very important in the Vietnamese culture. But that's kind of us. And you know, my mom said it was actually a very pleasant boat ride. So we were really, really lucky to be able to escape. Next slide. Okay, so I think Dr. Mai was talking about Fort Chaffee. That's where we ended up to be processed. This is not our photo. This is photo from the internet again. We didn't have any photos. We had a few, but not really. They were there to be processed, and there were a lot of people there that my parents knew. Jenny, if you enjoyed Jenny Tran Weaver's spring rolls, her family were friends with my family. She was inspired by her parents. They lived in Allen Parkway. There was a housing unit with a lot of Vietnamese nationals back in the 70s. That's now just down the street, but you know, very nice over there now. But that's where they lived, so we know Jenny very well. She was processed there, and you know, she and I are friends now, and we talk about our family. She was inspired by her mom making noodles inside out, you know, in the apartment, selling it to the neighbors. So they were there, they got processed, and they were sponsored by a gentleman that my aunt met, and so that's how we came back down to Houston. I joked when Dr. Mai was talking about like flat and hot and humid. I said, Mom, why didn't we end up in California or Hawaii? She's like, no, we wanted to come somewhere that was flat and hot, and it resembled Saigon. Concrete, lots of concrete. So there we went. Next slide, please. So this article appeared on the front page of the Houston Chronicle on Sunday, June 15th, 1975. And over the years, I would read it. And if I may, I'm just going to read a few excerpts for you because I really love this story. That is my attorney cousin who lives in Laredo. This is my brother who is a veteran Houston Police Department officer, my grandmother who's deceased. And this is my aunt. She's not with us tonight, but she does live in Houston, and her son is in Laredo. And that's my father. My father passed away a few years ago, but that's him standing around furniture. And lo and behold, it flooded in Houston in 1975. So Sum Nguyen, my father, 32, huddled on a dining room table and watched the floodwaters rise around the table legs. He was not alone. 8 other members of the Vietnamese refugee family crowded around him in the small southeast Houston home. That was Monday night. They had arrived in Houston Sunday from Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. The family fled Saigon on April 24th, taking only clothes with them. A Houstonian, Wallace Schoenfeld, he's now deceased, 32, had known the family when he worked as a civilian in Saigon 3 years ago. He sponsored the family. Schoenfeld was an auditor with the U.S. Customs Office. He found them a house on 3063 Row near Gulf Gate Shopping Center. And incidentally, I Googled it today. That house still sits there. It's just right off of Telephone Road. Friends and neighbors, many who attend St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Church, helped furnish the house, donated food, clothing, and toys. In spite of this generosity, however, his wife, my mother, 5 children, my siblings and my cousin, his sister and mother received a wet welcome to Houston. Monday's rainfall caused a nearby Sims Bayou to overflow its bank, flooded their home, damaged most of their belongings. Q1, my aunt there, is the younger sister, and she told of the family's plight. The rain didn't bother us at first, she said, but I didn't know the water would come inside the house. The water kept rising until she said it reached 2.5 feet above the floor. All of the furniture, the mattresses, and much of the clothing were soaked. I've heard this story over the years, but I actually sat down and just transcribed it from that photo, which was really nice. She learned English while she was singing at Saigon nightclubs. That's why she sang. She was perfectly coiffed and poised that day. Her mother wore the traditional Vietnamese dress there. In Saigon, Sum Nguyen, my father, made tapes of her songs, sold them. He also sold some cars as well. He was a captain in the Army. He worked as an administrative officer at a general hospital in Saigon. He was in the Army for 13 years. He had no opposition to fleeing the country because he did not support the communists. He did not fight in the war because he had a desk job. And he says the 5 children are happy. So I guess we were happy. I was 2 when I came. They cry sometimes because they want to go home. They were all wearing dog tags because that's how you could locate the kids. And that's, you can find out who they belong to. And these are our first days in Houston. Playing on wooden floors, living on 3063 Road Drive. So I love that photo because it really pretty much tells it all. This is our first days in Houston. Next. So, just like any kid, I didn't know I came from war-torn Vietnam. I just grew up in America, and I wanted to be American. So, some of the American things we would do is have Halloween. I grew up in Northwest, which was a northwest part of town, which was predominantly Vietnamese. But at a very young age, my father decided we're going to live in the west part of town, which is Memorial. It's sort of West Memorial, and so I grew up I say the white suburbs. But I wanted to be American, and so did my siblings, and that's how we kind of grew. They forced us to speak Vietnamese in the household. Thank God for that. I hated it. I wanted to be American, but that's how we grew up. Next. And in the 80s, just like any Americanized family, we had perms. See, everybody had a perm. We went to Disneyland. We did all the things that American families, we actually got on a plane for the first time to New York. Did a lot of wonderful things. My parents really wanted us to have a good sort of home life and experience. So we did a lot of fun things. A lot of friends who lived in California, we would visit them, drive from Houston to Southern California and stay with family members and friends, and just really had that sort of experience. Next slide. The other experience I had was being a child of immigrants growing up in small businesses. So my parents opened the first pho restaurant. Back then they probably didn't know, so they called it a tea house. This is actually, for those of you who know Houston, it's actually where Minute Maid Park is. So if you look, so the other day I thought, I was driving home from something, I thought, let me just drive by and look at it. That's me photobombing. But this is my parents running their tea house, and I spent many, 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 many days sitting at the restaurant, helping my mom make wonton. But that's what it looks like now. It's a bar, and if you can see, that's the convention center. That sign is still there, but that is a bar, and that's the alleyway. And so some of the structure's still there, but it's really Edo, right? So it's Edo now. But just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what it would look like, what it did look like, and what it does look like. Next slide. So the other thing they did is they always dabbled in small businesses. Very, it's very much like a lot of Vietnamese immigrant families dabbling. They had convenience stores. They were flippers. They would buy a convenience store, sell it to another Vietnamese family, and they did that dozens of times. In the 80s, during the oil bust, a lot of foreclosures. So Vietnamese families would save up their money, like literally save it up in cash, and my parents would put together convenience stores and sell it to other families. There are some convenience stores still around. This one's in River Oaks, actually. If you look, this is actually West Gray and Shepherd, but that's what it looks like now. There's a Barnes & Noble there. There's a very beautiful restaurant, La Grilla. So that's kind of how we grew up, the child of immigrant parents. Next slide. Okay, other businesses, they had a little motel, they did restaurants, all kinds of things. And I think it's very indicative of most immigrant families, is that's how we, made our business. My father was a songwriter. I mean, he wrote music in Vietnam, but he came here and he kind of hustled and figured out real estate and dabbled in all kinds of things. And so I was influenced by watching them, and I thought, when I grow up, my parents were like, you're either going to be a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, you're going to be a disgrace to the family. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's really a joke. I just kind of watched them, businesses, and I watched a lot of TV. There were only 3 channels. So the next slide, there was this one Asian woman on TV, and I thought, I could be her. So there, I was her. So I thought, I'm going to be Connie Chung. I'm going to emulate her. I want the hair, the whole thing. So I worked a little bit in TV here, off air. And my first on-air job was actually in Guam. So I actually moved halfway around the world to Guam, and then I moved to Saipan, and I did TV in my early 20s there. And then I kind of went on my TV career and tour. Took a next slide. I went from Saipan, and then I went back to Houston. So I spent some time in Houston, and I went to Atlanta, and I came back to Houston. Next slide. And one of the coolest things about TV is I saw my life kind of come full circle. I went with my mom in 1997 to meet my family for the first time. In 2000, I went back for a medical mission. I think Allison mentioned that in my bio. So we spent a lot of time. That's my photographer, Lynn. No connection. There's a lot of wins now in Houston. But we covered a medical mission. We followed this wonderful group of doctors and nurses. Actually, it was my doctor, and as fate would have it, he and I are having a conversation. He's going, so we go. And then we did a 2-part documentary series on the Fox station here, and that's how we won our Emmy Award. Next slide. And by the way, Lynn still works here at Channel 13. So this is 2020. He's still a photographer here. Next slide. Love him. Win the Emmy. Wonderful life. It's really coming full circle, because you really get to see those rural parts of Vietnam that you didn't know existed. Next slide. So I went back from Atlanta to KHAU, where I ended up as a news anchor. But this whole time, I was always shaped by my parents' plight, the aid of Catholic Charities and others. And then as a reporter, I got to see so many things I was exposed to, going to marginalized communities, meeting people who didn't have a voice, wondering how I could serve. And I've always had a servant's heart, if you will. I volunteered as a teenager, volunteered as a young adult. So in 2008, I decided to hang it up because I was searching for something more. I knew I wanted to give back, but I wasn't sure really what I wanted to do. I was in my early 30s. So I did that to 2008. Then I decided, next slide, I'm going to return to my roots. I'm going back to Vietnam. So I had a sabbatical. That's my aunt. She's right there. Thought I'd give her a little plug. So I go back to Vietnam. I spend some time there, and I decide, what am I going to do? Travel Southeast Asia a little bit, hike. That's in Dalat. That's my mom's hometown, actually. So, next slide, please. I decided, instead of going back to this path, I'm going to be a social worker, because a social worker allows me to serve, allows me to connect. Wasn't sure what I was going to do, but henceforth I became a social worker. And that was in 2010. Next slide. During that time, I got married, I got divorced, and then I had 2 beautiful kids. So generationally, my kids are half Caucasian. They don't speak Vietnamese, no judgment. But they're really wonderful girls. It's Ryan and Miles. They were born in 2010 and 2012. They're now 10, almost 10, and almost 12. Today, for the last 6 years, I worked a little bit at an organization called the Women's Home. I'm now at the Houston Area Women's Center. Michelle is with me. She serves on our team. We have a mighty team. We work to support survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I feel like I have the dream job. I got to marry my love of connecting with people and communicating to serving. So we do a little bit of everything. We march, you know, we advocate, we support the clients we serve. That's my leadership team. Next slide. And then you think, well, I'm out of TV. I'm never going to do TV, but you can't take the TV because of the work I do a lot of TV still. In fact, today somebody called. There was a really terrible quadruple murder-suicide. So I speak on this side now. I speak on behalf of our mission and trying to educate people and raise a broad awareness about what we do. So you can't take the TV out of the girl, but you can take the girl out of the TV. I end with a quote. That's me then, me now, and I would say, you know, I think about like who I am and what I've done, and I'm so thankful that you know, my history and my family's history and just being exposed as an immigrant child has been such a wonderful journey. So I think about like, what do? I love this Irma Bondet quote. It's carried with me for the years, and it says, "When I stand before God at the end of my life, I would hope that I would not have a single bit of talent left, and it could say, I used everything you gave me." So this is kind of my next iteration, social worker and mother and advocate, and you know, friends and family and community and service to others is my passion. Next slide. And I couldn't do this without my parents and letting the generations go on, because they are the reason we're here. I can't, you know, as I get older, I really am so touched by their courage and their plight. My mother talks about, if she was 23 years old, she had 4 kids, 2, 4, 6, 8. She worked at Kmart. When she got here, she didn't speak the language, so she would work at Kmart. My father worked at a mechanic shop. She would work from 4 to 9 p.m. She would take care of the kids. He would come home from work. She would work from 4 to 9 at Kmart. And then she would come home, and my father, you know, he used to sell tapes and cassettes. They had a newspaper in California. They put an ad there. So at night, she would dub his music and sell it for $5. It cost her about $1, and so she would send it off. And so in the first 6 months, they made like $10,000, and that's what she would do. She would work from 9 till 3 or 4 in the morning, just dubbing music. I love that story. I mean, that's the hard work of Vietnamese people. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Alice.
Have you ever reached out to Connie Chung to tell her how much she influenced you?
Well, here's the funny thing. Connie is like an icon in the Asian American journalists group, right? And I used to be a part of the Asian American Journalists Association. And it was just, and I'm still very close to a lot of the Asian female journalists. My story of being influenced by Connie Chung is not unlike many Asian journalists around my age. And so she would come to the conference, and we'd have like, you know, all these Connie Chung little fangirls like us. She totally knows. She's like, yeah, I know. Y'all watched me on TV.
Oh,
that's why you guys are here. But yeah, she is.
She had her
you know,
following.
She really was the first
Yes.
Asian woman, you know, in a position like that, and it really did shape my interest. I mean, I think there are other things. I was a curious child. I love to write. You know, I love to read, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But Connie Chung is really the place where it all kind of began.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, this was so inspiring. I loved it. Do y'all have other questions? Yes.
And then I will tell you, my kids and I, and Jay, and my mother, we're all going to Vietnam next Thursday.
Oh.
So in a week from now, we'll be on a plane. So this will be their first trip. My mother and I have been a few times, so really special, and it really kind of makes my life feel like it continues to come full circle to the homeland. Go ahead, Michelle.
So I had a question about your dad's name. Was it really spelled when he was in music?
So it's a stage name. His name is,
That makes sense.
Tung, not Nguyen.
Okay.
But his stage name was Sum Ngap, and he's written 400 plus songs. There is a very famous group called Quoc-Anh. They do these ridiculous Quoc-Anh, like 273 sort of musical programs, variety shows. And so his music's been there, and it was, it's been copyrighted. He passed away in 2018, and so we sold his copyright for 10 years to the Quoc-Anh family so that his music can live on YouTube, and it is on YouTube. For some reason, he has his own wiki page. I used to joke, people would meet, you know, Vietnamese families, we all know each other. You know, we're all, who's your family? And I used to joke, I am not the famous, it's my dad. They're like, oh my God, your dad is so-and-so? I used to sing his music at, you know, weddings and these kinds of things. So his music was very popular in Vietnam.
It's wonderful.
Question and comment. The first question, I think you answered it already, was is there any revival of your dad's music in Vietnam? I know it's becoming a popular fad to listen to South Vietnamese music.
I think there is, and I think it's through Quoc-Anh, right? So the mega empire, the Sony Records of Vietnam is Quoc-Anh, and they've really been able to morph their music business to not just here in the West, because things have changed so much, right? You go to Vietnam now, it's like you're in a Western town. Skyscrapers, we're staying at 5-star hotels. It's very different now. So I think there is a resurgence among people. There's some songs that we've looked at on YouTube that have millions of views, and it's like, oh my gosh. And you know, it's funny when you're raised. You know, my parents are immigrants; they're working. I never thought of my father as famous or somebody big deal, but when he passed away, it was a really big deal. I was like, wow. You know, his music really left. You know, it had a lot of influence on millions of people and young people too. It's really touching.
And the comment, I just remember seeing that same list of professions, options. But one of mine, I grew up in a Catholic family, was priest. So good father, son.
Yeah, that's right. I should have added that too.
I'm so happy that I came to this meeting here.
Yay.
I'm from Illinois, and so my understanding of Vietnamese is that I go to a nail shop and get my nails done, and they're such hardworking people, and they do such a good job. But you've given me a whole different take on Vietnamese culture and how far it's come and how far it's going.
Yeah, I just feel like Vietnamese, at least, you know, growing up in Houston, most of the Vietnamese families, they were all working. They might have been lawyers and, you know, but they were all doing different things, running businesses. Dr. Mai talked about the shrimpers in Seabrook. We spent lots of weekends there hanging out with those families, you know, and spending time with them. And I remember my father was pulled over by a police officer, and he was scared because he was worried about the racism and the tensions that ignited back then. So I remember, I vividly have memories of the shrimping business and friends and tension, and yeah.
It's so cold in Illinois. I'm gonna tell them to come on to Texas.
I'm glad you joined us. She just was a visitor today, and
Oh.
somebody twisted her arm to come back.
No,
Dana.
really.
And she did, so thank you.
Well, thanks for letting me share my story.
Oh,
It was just
yeah.
really wonderful to put it together and really reflect on it as well.
Thanks, Jen.
So before you all take off, I just want to quickly, and we don't leave because we have lots of more, you know, wine and cheese. But this museum that we just recently renovated, this is the Alley Theater's 75-year anniversary. So what you see in here are some of their more recognizable costumes and set designs. They won an award as well. They make everything in-house. They've been around, you know, like I said, 75 years. They really did start in an alley off Main Street, hence the name. And then they got a lot of money. And I believe Martha was saying, that
My husband was
Yes.
on the committee to fund this
the building.
new building.
Yes. So.
He represented Chau.
Oh, of course. And then so back then they built it in the 60s. So it has a wonderful history story. So y'all sign up for our newsletter because we change out our exhibits. We've got another lady coming this summer that made bronze collars of women all across the United States. Recognizable women, Harriet Tubman, Barbara Jordan. So she's going to be here this summer. So we change these out, and then we always have parties before and after. So we'd love for you all to get more involved and learn more about us. Thank you for being here.
Would you like to do a commercial for Park?
Well, Michelle's with me. Michelle's our training director at the Houston Area Women's Center. You know, this is our 45th anniversary. I serve as a Chief Public Strategies Officer. It allows me to continue to communicate and do what I really love to do is talk. But I get to share the mission and the message and the work of our clients in their healing journey. We have active volunteers. We have a robust volunteer core. We love for you guys to get engaged. As you know, domestic violence is not doing well in our city. We had a quadruple murder suicide today. So we you know, for us, advocacy and sharing our message and educating and hopefully getting the community engaged in this is really important to us. But if you want to learn more, you just head to HAWC or reach out to Michelle or I. Yeah.
I know that you were trying to collect kits and so
Oh,
forth.
yeah. So you know, on our website we have something called Pop Kits. Those are kits for clients, survivors, their children, snack kits, kits for women who escape abuse and go to the shelter. They need things like toiletries, kits for the kids. We have a very active hospital accompaniment program where our advocates and counselors hold the hand of clients who've been sexually assaulted or have been abused and are at the hospital. They have to surrender their clothes often because of for evidence for the police investigation. If you can imagine being sexually assaulted or beaten up, you're not thinking about bringing your clothes, an extra change of clothes. So we do provide that, pants, you know, leggy pants, t-shirts, socks, underwear, bra. So we're always looking for those kinds of things, and it's a wonderful way and I've done this with my kids, put kits together, you know, put a nice message and donate it to support in a little way or a big way. So thank you, Rach.
Thank you for making such a difference.
Oh, thank
Both
you.
of you all
It's been
just
really fun.
thank you. And love that